Yeah. So data binding, or rather specifically, let's say it as a binding, because we have many different type of bindings we have in Angular, right? Like we have property bindings, we have class bindings, we have style bindings, we have event bindings, so many things which basically tends to one simple thing, that communicating everything between templates and class. Okay, so let's go with the same simple plain property itself, which we started learning, called name. I hope, if I'm not wrong, it was name, which the default one had, right? Let's say Tom, and this is a property which belongs to the component class, right? And component class is tied to the template, which is home component HTML. Now here, let's, oh, we have a simple markup here. That's fine. So let's take a simple
I think
here.
before we use title, yeah, title in the
Yeah,
braces.
yeah. I think, yeah, it was like, we'll use the same, like welcome, for instance, right? It was the same. Welcome. So for instance, if I say Tom, for instance, right now here we are actually hard coding the name. If I go
Yeah.
to the page here, you can see it says welcome Tom. But now we are more interested in actually checking out this to be communicated through our component class, right? So let's say we have name here. So let me go back here and say flower brackets and say name. Now this is called as a interpolation, which is we are actually kind of a binding the data name here. So if you see this name, which is assigned over here, is kind of assigned binded to this. So if I go back here, you can see it's the same value. If I change something in here, let's say Tom123, save it, go back, it refreshes Tom123. This is
Yeah.
called as interpolation, and interpolation is one of the strong concept we have in Angular, which can be used for many um, concepts basically. So in Angular JS, right, or we can also call interpolation as a one-way binding, which means whenever we change anything over here, right, it automatically get affected wherever it is binded.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we talk about binding, just keep it in mind, we are talking about template, right, and we are talking about component, right?
Yeah.
So when we are
Yesterday we were discussing like changing in the text box, right?
Yeah, exactly. We'll come to that part
Okay.
also, right? So,
Okay.
which means when, see, as of now, we're talking about, you can say that we are talking about one-way binding, okay? So, whatever I have in my component class, that we are actually binding to my template. So,
Yeah.
it's like we are actually going in a one step more. So, finally, we'll see a big chunk of data coming up in service, binding into component and dumping into HTML template, taking data from template and getting back to component and throwing it back to service. That level will go. Okay, but this is a stepping stone for everything, right? So so same way, for instance, let's take this interpolation, right? Let's see what different things we can actually do with this. Okay, so this is one of them. Now let's say if I want to do, I think this you would have known of this if you are aware of JS. I can do all the operations. It can be arithmetic operations, or it can be string operations. String operations, I mean like a concatenation and stuff, right? We can do it in interpolation itself, right? So this is a basic example which we always see. Like if I say 2 plus 2 here, I'm sorry, 2 plus 2 here, this interpolation understands that yes, we are trying to do something, right, with these two numbers, which is sum. So if I go back and see in my screen here, you can see it says 4. Okay, let me just take a oh, let me close this, we don't need this file. So let me just have a simple br here, like just divider, right, where I can see that this is a simple operation we did. So similarly, as I said, we can also have a string concatenation, right? So let me
Yeah.
take a simple PR here. Let's say I have hello plus, let's say word, right? So if I go back here, you'll see this. So it understands that I'm actually doing a string concatenation. Now, what happens if I actually use, so this is one interpolation which does some operation. I can extend this interpolation to any number of things. So for instance, if I say hello world. Let's say I'm going to bind name again here, which means the same property is actually binded across my template. And here we are actually binding two different stuffs here, right? If I go back here, you can see hello world, so and so. Similarly, I can even create some behaviors here. Behaviors meaning, for instance, if you have some functions, right? So let's say get data. I have a simple function. So let's follow everything in camel case, right? So a simple function get data. Let's say I'm gonna return something called this is function, right? So now this function, if I don't have any access modifier, we know that everything is a public one, right? So you don't have to actually specifically mention public, but it's always good to habituate, providing what access modifier is your intention. Because if sometimes if you don't actually have any access modifier, right, it may be public, but it's always better to have a habituate to actually provide a access modifier, right? So now it's a public get data, which is my behavior or a function we define. Now even this function can be called in a binded interpolation. So I'll actually say just say something called get data. Now this will actually it understands that we're trying to actually access a function which is get data, which is actually kind of binded to the existing component here. You can see here this is a function. Now this is a kind of an interpolation binding we're actually doing, which also used to call as a one way binding. So always I mean, if you have any understanding of old AngularJS, we had like many type of bindings. um, I mean, among them, famous ones are like we had one way binding, we have one time binding, we have something called two way binding. Anyways, we are going to see all these things which are actually kind of uh, which we need for communication between components and templates we have, right? But here when we talk about one way, right, understand this, one way is nothing but it's always the upward flow. If I have a component and template, whatever data I'm actually passing on from component to template, it always communicates in that direction. One time is nothing but, anyways, we don't have specifically called one time in Angular, but it's better to understand this because if you're trying to work on a migration project, right, whatever one time bindings we have, right, may not be a directly migrated here. So one time binding in Angular was like this. So if we have any binding, if you just give colons here, right, so this means that we are trying to give a one time binding, one time binding in the sense give and forget. So as once this HTML is rendered, and after that, if you try to change the name from any text box or anything, or it is binded to any connected component property, or it is binded to some other component, it doesn't matter. Once it renders, in that life cycle of that page, until you refresh or go back and come back to that page and stuff, right? The value will always stay same. That's one time binding. Okay. And now I think you understand two-way binding. Two-way binding is nothing but I can give and also can take, which means template can talk to component, component can talk to template. That's a two-way binding we have. Okay. So we're gonna look into one-way and two-way bindings also through different type of bindings. Okay. So here, if I just go into colon here, if you see here, right, it doesn't actually, when I save this and come back here. Oh, one moment, sorry. So when I save this file and come back, see, so nothing is populated. Why? If I go to DevTools here and look into console, it says that it doesn't understand what in Angular mainly doesn't understand what is this. It says that there is a template parts error. It doesn't understand unexpected token at column 1. It doesn't understand because in Angular, if you try to give these things, it doesn't understand. That's why I will just give an example with respect to AngularJS. So now once you save, go back here. Now you can see it's everything is plain and running, and you have your page rendered. That's your interpolation binding we have in here. Any questions here?
No, I'm good.
You're good. So similarly, now you know, right now. Now you can actually extrapolate into any level of binding. Now if you have an object, for instance, let me take one more example. Let's say I have a public, let's say my data, which is an object. Okay, so let's say I have an ID called 123. I have we used to take name, right? We used to take name, let's say bin, right? Let's say for instance we have two properties in an object. Now can I access this object using interpolation here? Yes, because
Yeah.
every data you have, right, you can do that. So now here what I can do, let me have a simple br, and let's say I'm gonna take my data, right? Let me just print the complete object. Let's see what it does. Okay, so now let me save it and get back here. So now if you see here, it says object, which means that yes, it does understand that my data is an object, right? Because here
Mhm.
my data, we actually gave it as an object. Now, what I want to understand what exactly is a name. So I can actually go back to this and say dot name, right? So if you go back here, you can see bin.
Mhm.
Now this is how we access the object, right? So we have an
Okay.
object with different properties, and now you can actually think over whenever we talk to REST services. So what is the main protocol we have in REST service? It's a JSON, right? It's a
Mhm.
JSON communication protocol, and indirectly JSON is nothing but an object or
Yeah.
array of objects, right? End of the day.
Yeah.
So now we know how to bind an object. Now, which means whenever we talk to any endpoint service, when we get data, we know, at least we know a starting idea of how we can actually bind from a component, handle it, and the same data how to bind it into our templates. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So that's how we normally do. So in the same way, we have something which are restricted. Restricted or kind of, we can't actually use interpolation for those things. So let me do whatever we are actually doing at the top of file so that, so for instance, let me take a simple div here. Now, let's say I'm going to take a simple interpolation and say, let's say I have two variables here. Let's say public, maybe a is equal to 10 and public b is equal to maybe 90, right? Now can I do a plus b here? Yeah, anyways, it does understand that, uh,
Yeah. We can
it
do.
does
Yeah.
understand, yeah, because here what it is doing, you can understand that it is actually applying the interpolation. Let's see the, so this is the result. It does apply interpolation, but also it does interpolation and it understands that okay, these are the number types, and it does do a sum. Now
Yeah.
for instance, if I do a as a string, then what happens?
It just prints maybe.
So now let's go back and see. Now you can see here, now it's the same principle again. See, everywhere
Yeah.
it's a global. Whenever we start with string and start using plus across, right, what it does, everything else it considers as if it's a string. Right.
Yeah.
So 10 is a string and everything else. So interpolation does a true conversion. So for instance, if I
And
take,
even JavaScript, it does same thing, right?
exactly. See, end of the day, when I say TypeScript, it's a JavaScript we're applying, right?
Yeah.
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 So end of the day, the main theme here is understanding this interpolation. So it does interpret everything in a proper way. So for instance, if I give a plus b plus a string, then what happens?
It adds first two, then print other one.
Exactly. So same, it does some. So all the rules, right, the Bodmer's rules, whatever you have, it does apply to everything. Okay, that's my main theme here. Now
Mhm.
I have one more thing. So for instance, let's say if I assign a value, let's say I say a is equal to b, right, in an interpolation. So here what we are doing is, this is not an operation. This is something which is an assignment, which means there
Yeah,
is
it
no
may
output.
not happen.
Exactly. So these type of things we can't actually do it in interpolation. Okay. It can be anything. It can be assignment. It can be a simple expression which doesn't actually gives an output, and that output is holded by interpolation. All those operations cannot be done in this interpolation binding.
Got it.
Okay. So that's how it is. I'm not just taking any variables. It can be anything. I can be a is equal to b, or it can be, you can actually give any operation as such. For instance, doesn't matter. End of the day,
Yeah.
this is actually
It has
doing,
to print something,
it
right?
has to
Yeah.
give an output, valid output, which can be
Output value
binded.
something.
Exactly,
Yeah.
which can be binded. So now if I do that, right, and if you go to dot tools, you can see it just says that it's a parsing error because it doesn't understand what exactly it is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so these things I actually can't do. So I can just comment it out, get back, and your page renders. So this is something which you have to understand. In any template, if anything goes wrong, for instance, right,
Mm-hmm.
and if you have multiple components, so if that component have any error which Angular actually cannot convert into a proper rendering HTML, right? Then that component may not be rendered, and it's always the first thing what you should always do is just try to look into console if there is something wrong. See, even if some
Okay.
endpoint fails, even if some component it has some errors, everything, right? Everything. The first step is to look into console, and then the second thing is to, if you are actually doing any network related activities, for instance, if you are doing any service calls or anything and it fails, then the next step is to go into network. Okay,
So how
anyways,
to go to console from you?
yeah, you can either, you can right click and say inspect, or just click on F12.
Okay.
Okay, if you click on F12, then it will automatically go to console. I mean, these are the dev tools. You can always keep it like
Oh, I thought this is separate. Okay, like Devtool. Okay, got
yeah,
it.
yeah, it's a dev tool. It's a Chrome. I mean, I'm actually using IE Chromium. It's a new. It's almost like the same Chrome actually. So I mean, if you, I mean, you can actually use any of your favorite browser. It doesn't matter. But yeah, you can actually go into the dev tools and you can actually get the errors. Okay, clear,
Okay.
perfect. So this is how we normally do interpolation, kind of a binding data from component to HTML. So now we have some more concepts in here anyways, so they are actually which actually covers up either of them. So let's go into next type of binding, which is a property binding. Now what is a property binding? So let's say, let me take a simple example of anything which is related to input, for instance. So which is like, we all know what is input, right? Input can be
Yeah.
anything, right? So
Button or text box or anything.
yeah, if you know HTML4 or 5, doesn't matter. 5 may have more more features in input, but end of the day, input is something which can be used across. It can be a text, it can be a button, checkbox, data, anything. So for
Yeah.
instance, let me take a simple text. Okay, and let me give a simple, I think we gave a simple value. Let's say I'm gonna give a simple value called something. Okay, and then let me close. And we know that every HTML element will have attributes. So these are called as attributes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Attributes. So when we talk about HTML world, we normally call them as an attribute, right? Now,
Yeah.
when we speak from an Angular world to the template, we normally call them as a properties.
Okay.
Okay, so now for instance, I have type, I have value. For instance, let me take some more. So id is the one which will be using for a property binding mostly. For instance, if I want to bind something with an id, for instance, we normally give, let's say this is my input. For instance, this is my id, my input, for instance, right? So for this element called input, okay, there are three different attributes called type, value, and id, right? And they have their own IDs there. Now, we can also provide this data through Angular. Scenario can be, or situations can be anything, but we can actually have a properties binded through our properties which are defined in our component class. Fine. So let me just get back here and see. You have a text box which is filled with some data, right? I can even actually have something typed in here which will actually accept something. Now, so this is my id. So now when we are actually going towards the codes, we'll actually understand some more bindings about event or two-way binding and stuff, where we'll see that how we can actually use a unique identifier of any element which can be used to actually communicate the data between template and component. Okay, So now here the important thing is how can I actually bind something with my property. Now let's say here I just gave a hard-coded property name for instance, but I want to make it dynamic. Yes, we can do that. Now how can we do that? Anything which you want to bind in properties or attributes or predefined elements of any HTML element, for instance, then we normally give them in a square bracket. Events we give in a curly bracket. Bindings or interpolation we give in a flower bracket. Okay, there are few things which once you get into practice mode you'll understand. So whatever I normally give in square braces, consider them as we are actually trying to bind to the property.
Okay.
Clear? Okay. So now instead of actually hard coding this, for instance, let's say I have a property here. It got freezed. Okay, what's going on? Okay, so let's say I'm gonna give public my ID as my, or just say my input, right? Now before I change the binding here, let me save this and let me just keep it without this property binded. Let's go back to this and let's see how it is now. If I clicked on inspect before F12 but it didn't work. Okay, I think it got freeze. Okay, now you can see here, so the ID is created, which is like a identifier for this element called input, which is my input. So this was hard coded. Now let me come back here and say I want to bind with some property here. So let's say my input for text. Now I can go back here, bind it with a square braces, and just give the property name. Property name is nothing but my ID. Just say my ID. Now get back here. Now we have this input, for instance. So let's get into inspect mode. Now you can see here. So we have an element, and for this element, the ID you can see here. We just binded this as a property binding, but end of the day, it created the final rendering of this HTML element, created a new attribute or a same attribute called ID. ID is something which is under which browser can understand, saying that okay, this is an identifier for this input, and the value of ID you can see this is a binded one. So this came from a property binding which we gave from property over here. Okay, so this is how we can actually do any property bindings.
Okay.
Fine. So yeah, so in this way it can be anything. It can be value, it can be type. Even if you want to give the type of this, for instance, you can directly bind, right? And you can actually pass on this types. For instance, if you have text, button, right, or checkbox, anything, if you want to decide what type of this input you want to be, you can just bind it into property binding and pass the value from here. Okay,
Okay.
and that will be automatically taken from here. So let's see one example. For instance, if I have an input and I have, for instance, let me take this as a binding property and let me create a simple property here called public. Let's say my input type, for instance. Let's say I'm gonna give text. Get back here. So this is my binding property I have. Let's give this value. Right? Let's say I'm gonna give this much. Right? Now let's get back to here. Now you can see here it automatically gave me a text box type text which is property binded actually, and then it automatically enabled me to do something. So let's say I'm gonna give it as checkbox. Checkbox. Save it. Come back here. If you see, it's a checkbox here.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the theme of property binding is you can actually create elements or attributes of an element which is binded. Now you know that when we say that okay, if it is binded, if you want to decide, you can see those elements are actually getting up here. You can even decide this by an expression. Expression meaning, for instance, when the constructor is the one which always does, or which is always triggered whenever the class is instantiated, right? Now, when I say class is instantiated, which means whenever the component is instantiated, automatically the constructor is kind of triggered, right? So let's say I want to decide this input type not as a hard coded, but I want to decide on some value. For instance, I want to decide based on a value called a. Okay. Now, how can I say that? So, for instance, let's take a simple example of if a is greater than, let's say, 5, then let's say input type, I'm just gonna say input, which is this dot my input type as text. I want it as text. Else, let's say this dot my input type as something, let's say button. Now we're getting a step ahead. Now we have a property, but we are deciding we are deciding property or any value of a property based on some logic. So anyways, this is not a big complex logic, but yes, this is a logic saying that okay, fine, if my a value is 10, or if my a value is greater than 5, okay, then let's make this input as text. Otherwise, let's make input as button. This may not make sense, this logic may not make sense, but end of the day we are actually doing something which dictates what type of input we want to do this. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
now we know that a value is 10 here, right? Now
Yeah.
if I go back here, for instance, if I go back to this, now you can see this is text, right? So for, let's say I want to make it 3 value, go back here, refresh, you can see it's a button. It's different that it is rendered. You can have the text for it and stuff, that's different altogether. Okay, and let's say I'm gonna give some value for this, something called something control, for instance, right? Save and go back, right? Something. So this, but by end of the day, the property binding with a property which is native to component, right, can be driven from certain logic, which means now you understand that every element we have a hold of attribute level of element, fine, which can be controlled through your component, fine. So that's
Mm-hmm.
how we can actually have something called property binding. So any questions across the property binding or anything you want to see?
No, no, I'm good.
Perfect. So now let's go one step ahead. So now we have seen property binding, we have seen interpolation. Now let's go on and see something inside this component. Now we were talking about something called styles, right? And I think we created some styles. Yeah, like H1, right? Which we applied directly to the template, but we didn't apply to the template HTML, but that's fine. Let's try to see a few more things in here because we have something called a class binding. Now you may get a question that why do we need a specific class binding? I can apply this class directly. There are so many situations which we may need, but let's get into a simple mode first and then let's see the binding. Okay, let's say I have a div, and this, for instance, this is a statement. Let me give some text in it. Now here what I want to do, I want to create a simple class. So you know how to create a CSS class? Any let's say, for instance, let's say my div, I'm creating a simple, when I give any class with a dot, which means I can actually call this as a class name for any HTML element. If I
Yeah,
give
yeah.
a direct, yeah, if I give a direct element name, which means
It will take it as
yes, any
element.
element if I use with a hash, yeah. Similarly, we have many. We have a hash. We have, right? When I give a hash, which means we are actually giving a ID base. So there are multiple. But now what I'm doing is I'm actually trying to give a simple class which can be consumed as a class attribute. Now again, for instance, in this my div, let me give a color of red. So now how can I use this in here? So this is my element. What I can do, I can give a class attribute and say my
My div.
div. So now, so this my div. is the class which is actually created in CSS file, and this CSS file is coupled with the styles, and the same component we have HTML, and in HTML I'm actually using my div. So this will be applied. So now if I go back here, you can see this is a statement. Let me just close. This is a statement, and what did we apply? We applied color. Okay. Now let me just say font color.
I think we have to put text color or something.
What the color should work? Class as my div, which we gave in dot. Yeah, let's say with the color. Come on, I used to have this color. Sorry, not come on. So let's have the text. It's a font color actually. Font color. Oh, come on. Oh, is it not binded? One second. Component dot scss.
To put comma, we put semicolon, right?
Yeah,
Above.
I'm giving different classes to this. So if I give some font size for instance, let me just check like 40 px here. One second. So this is my class here, which is applied fine. So if you go to the styles here, styles are not getting applied. Yeah, styles are not getting applied. Div display bar. Why? Something wrong. I gave some typing wrong. Home dot component dot css. It's good. Let me try directly here. That's fine. So let me give. Let me take this. Let me take this class and place it here. I'm sure maybe some name or something spelling I would have missed for sure. I'm just taking my div, color, font, and in HTML we have a my div. Perfect. See, it gets applied. I mean, there is nothing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Like somehow this is not getting CSS home dot component dot. Yeah, what's wrong in it? Uh, did I give? Let's try. Let's try. Let's try. Let's not leave this. Let's try with home dot component dot css. Just copy this file name. I'm not able to. Yeah, it's the same, right?
Same,
Slash
yeah.
dot. Yeah, and then let's go back. We change this to test our CSS, right? So we have styles and style URLs, right? If I'm actually giving a file path, then I should have style URLs. If I'm giving the internal, I mean the CSS within the same component, then I can have styles. Okay, that's fine. You can see now it's getting applied.
Yeah.
That's fine. Okay, cool. Good that we checked this. Okay, so now, anyways, we applied even the font size. That's fine. So here, what were we talking? We were talking actually about the
Class
class
binding.
binding, right? So now we have a template. Now we have a combination of everything. We have a class, we have a component created, right? And we have HTML, which is actually trying to use the class. So now here, right, this class which is used is kind of a static usage, right? So let's say, for instance, this is my div. Let me create some more. Let's say my div. Let's say error, right? So let's give this as color as red. Let me remove this. Let me give this as some blue, just to differentiate. Let's say I'm gonna give some more color called my div. Let's say success, right? And let's say color as green. So now, is it green? Which got it? Yeah, I want this green for instance. So now I have three different classes, right? Now, when we know that we have to apply some class to this div, we just apply, right? And applied and stuff. Okay, fine. Now, for instance, conditionally, I want to apply this class here. Now, can we do that in static way? We can't do that, right? Now, this is a situation, one of the situation where you may get saying that, yeah, I want to apply the class dynamically based on some situations. Now, in that situation, what we do? We normally use something called class binding. So we have one more concept called style binding. We'll see that later. But let's see how we can actually bind a class using a property. Again, when we talk about class binding, again, we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about one of the inherent way how we can actually use a property but bind to the class attribute.
Yeah, here class is a
Yeah, you're getting it, right?
property.
You're getting it. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I got it.
But that we normally call it as a class binding. So now why we are looking into class specifically, because we have few different ways how we can actually have a class binding, because sometimes we may need so multiple classes to be binded together. Okay, that's why we are actually looking into this special stuff. Okay, which is called as a class
Okay.
binding. Now let's see how excuse me, how we can actually bind it. So now let me take few classes. Let's say a public, I am saying that plain class, uh, let's say I'm gonna say plain class as let's give this name as my div as something plain, right? So that we know that if it is a plain class, yes, it is blue, right? I'm just taking the class name. And let's say I have public, let's say error class,
Mm-hmm.
right? Let's say what's error class we have? My
My error.
div error, and then
Success.
let's take a success class. Let's say public success class as, I think it's my div success. Perfect. So now we have three different um, classes
Properties. Yeah.
maintained here, for instance, which are actually kind of I know um, uh, or they already have a specific different styles already plotted. And now what I want to do, I want to actually see how what I can actually assign, right, based on some condition. Now anyways, you can see that there are three different classes, sorry, three different properties which are assigned to three different classes, right? Now for
Yeah.
instance, let me take one more property called current class, because I can't assign three different properties directly, right? So
Yeah.
let me give a default current class as plain.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's start with plain first. So I'm gonna give, stop me whenever you get any question. Okay, don't hesitate to stop me. So here I have a current class. Now what I'll do, I'll go to my component. Now how can I bind it? Just guide me.
Square brackets.
Perfect. So when I say square bracket, which means Angular will create a separate class attribute for this div. Yeah, now when it creates a class attribute for this div, what to assign? So what I'm doing is I'm gonna,
Current class.
exactly, I just say that okay, don't worry about anything else, just stick to the value whatever you have in current class. Now let's get
Yeah.
back and see. You can see here. Now it's a blue. Why it is blue?
Mm-hmm.
Because my default value is this one.
Blue.
Now
Yeah.
let's take simple conditions. Let's say let's depend on this again. Let's say if a is greater than 5, let's even take this dot
Current class
current
is.
class as, let's make it as an error.
Okay.
Okay, what do you have? Error
Error
class.
class.
Fine, if it is greater than 5. Else,
Yeah.
let's say this dot current class is equal to Success class.
Success.
Success class. Perfect. Now, so as of now, in this class, as we don't know what is how I can actually change this value directly from HTML, don't worry. Okay. When we start, understanding how to pass a value, whatever I'm changing from HTML to component, then you can apply. But for now, I'm going to change it here itself. Okay. That you can do.
Okay.
Now, my A value is 3. And what I'm saying is A is greater than 5, then make it as error class, otherwise success class. So which class should get applied now?
Success class.
Success class. So now if I get back, you can see it's a green. So
Mhm.
now if I go back and change some value which is greater than 35, it will automatically become. Now you can
Yeah.
see that we are actually playing around, right? So many classes based on a condition. Now here, am I changing my HTML a lot? No. I just
No.
said, yeah, I mean, everything is, whatever is happening here is happening in the current class only. We are
Yeah.
not changing anything, right? So that's how
Yeah.
it actually goes. Now see one more beauty here. So for instance, I don't want to create any other classes and stuff. Whatever logic we are writing, can I directly write this in my HTML? We can do that. How? So for instance, if I say A is greater than 3, right? Then I'll say apply something called error class or apply success class. Don't worry if you don't understand. But do you get this?
Yeah, got it. This is
You got it,
conditional
right?
operator. Yeah.
Exactly. So if I go back here, you can see now this is called as an expression binding. Now this is one step ahead, which means we understood property binding. Now again we are in a property binding, but the decision of a value is defined by an expression.
Okay.
Okay. So now see, as of now, we gave a simple condition. Now you can understand that we can actually have anything we want. For instance, if I'm going to take if a is greater than 3, right? Let's say what's the value of a?
35, I think.
35. Okay, perfect. 3 and b is less than, let's say, 100, right? So now we increased a bit. I mean, anyways, now you can actually increase whatever you want. Now it says this is a statement because a is greater than 3 is true, b is less than 100 is also true, right? So let's say if I'll give a 10 here, now this condition fails. Now error, it if it condition fails, then it actually comes back to success class because this is a conditional operator, right? This
Yeah.
condition, if it is true, it will take first one. If it is false, it will take the next to the colon, which is for else case. It will take green. Now, which means you can have expressions anywhere. Now you understand that. Now getting back to the property binding again, wherever you see properties here, you don't have to actually have a direct property. You can also have a conditional property which also can return stuffs. Okay. Now,
Okay.
when I say property here, now I hope you understand I can also give a direct class here, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't have to actually create a separate property altogether. I can directly say my div success and here my div error, right? So if I get back, you can see it still maintain the same. So let's say I'm giving 100 here, get back. Now you can see that. That's how it works. Now, which means now it takes everything. The main strength here is the binding. The way you're binding, Angular understands that okay, fine. Don't take class as is whatever user is binding. Just take whatever he coded inside this, understand what it does, then resolve this class attribute to div. That's why if you go back to this element here, you will see a simple class. That's all. See, no logics,
Hmm.
nothing. It doesn't matter what exactly you're actually writing up in template or whatever you're actually writing up in wherever. It does resolve it. Now can you see here? So what's a class? It's a mydiv error. Can you see what's a mydiv error?
Yeah.
It's right. So the
Color red.
class, yeah,
Yeah.
and it does give you where exactly is this. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so that's how all these kind of I'm sorry, comes up. So any questions on this class binding here?
No, I got it.
Okay, so this is something which is a property binding, or I would say like you're binding a class, and but at the end of the day, you're binding a property or a class using your expression basically.
Mhm.
Okay. So I hope this is what we have now. In our next class, we'll actually see how we can actually bind something called multiple classes. Okay. So again, see whatever I'm talking about, right? Don't just stick into the same concept, because if you see, we started with the property binding, but we apply this property binding into class binding. But end of the day,
Mhm.
you can see concept as a property binding. But end of the day, if you just come back again, everything is a binding here, right? Everything whatever you are doing is a binding, which means everything whatever is driving from a component is kind of a binding. Now this is driving from a variables here, you can see this is actually kind of driven from a property, this is driven from a property, and everything else is driven from a property, or some direct interpolation math it is actually doing up end of the day. So end of the day, everything comes up into drill downs into a binding. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope that's what we have for today. And then moving a step ahead, we'll see how we can actually multiple class. See, multiple classes application is not is like a rare thing. We normally in real time we apply multiple classes. I mean, you take any simple component, there won't be any single class. We'll be applying multiple classes depending on different situations, basically, right? It can be for a user experience, or it can be for a information display, it can be for a hiding few things, or displaying few things on conditional. It can be anything, but we'll be using a multiple classes as such. So we'll see this multiple classes assignment in a property binding, under property binding, as a style binding and a class binding. First, we'll see with the class binding, and we also have something called ng class, which is, I mean, which was there in old Angular JSON. Here also we have, which is very beautifully maintained, where you can actually create multi-class accessor from your CSS and then bind to HTML. We'll see that tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay, any questions you have now?
No, I'm good.
You good? Perfect. And also we'll anyways, we all these things we are looking into the binding. Now we'll start actually looking into the data binding, the actual data binding. Okay, the intercommunication we do. I think
Mhm.
tomorrow itself we'll actually start the data communication between the component and this, and then passing across the component and stuff. Okay, and then from there
Okay.
on, I think we'll actually grow the concepts.